Hey everyone, in this video we will look into the second most common and widely used React hooks concept known as the use effect. Joining the line of use state, use effect is yet one of the React hooks concept which we commonly use in almost all React projects. And in this video, we are about to discuss the top 5 properties of this use effect. Starting with the types of dependencies, then how the React strict mode affects this use effect. And we will also look into how to create custom hooks using use effect. And moving forward, we will look into the most effective cleanup functions that we have in this use effect. Finally, we will wrap with the limitations of using use effect. So these are the top 5 properties in which this video is being divided into. Hope you got a better understanding of what we are about to discuss in this video. With this idea and without any further ado, let's get started. First, let's start by creating our React project. And for doing so, I will get the help of Beat. All I will do is, I will run the command npm create Beat@latest. Let me name the project as useEffect tutorial. Let's try opening our React project. Here inside our React project, let me run the command npm install. Here we have our React Beat project up and ready. Let's try running it. Here we have our default React app up and running. Now let's get started with the coding part. Here inside the source, we have the app.tss file. First let's try to get rid of this entire code. Now let's straight away look into how to use useEffect in our React project. The syntax for using useEffect is very simple. All you need to do is just type in useEffect. And this useEffect method is going to accept two parameters. The first is going to be the callback function and the second is going to be the dependency array, and it is going to be an optional parameter. Alright, so the first is going to be a callback function and the second argument is going to be totally optional. But in case if you want to provide, it is going to accept an array of values. Alright, so this is the basic syntax of using useEffect. So let me just explain this with the help of a simple example. Here inside this function, I am going to have a console log statement wherein I will type useEffect. Here let me apply some stylings with the help of Tailwind CSS. And if I head over to my browser and if I refresh this page, you will notice that the useEffect console log statement gets executed. Since we haven't mentioned any dependencies here, this useEffect gets called automatically whenever this app component gets mounted. And that is the reason we get this useEffect being logged in our console. Now let's look into the types of dependencies which we can provide for this useEffect and how to control this useEffect with the help of the dependency array. And to make it understandable, let me create a simple state variable here, wherein I specify the initial state as 0. And let me have a button over here. Inside the onClick event of this button, I will try to increase the counter value by the factor of 1. Alright. Now, in the previous example, we saw this console log statement getting executed at the very first beginning when this app component gets mounted, right? And this executes only once. Now what we need to do is, whenever we try to click this button, we need to execute this console log statement. And to do so, all we need to do is, instead of just leaving this dependency array empty, we need to provide this counter state variable here. By doing so, we tell React to execute this effect whenever this state variable changes. Alright, therefore whenever this button is being pressed, we try to increase the counter value, which in turn will trigger this effect. Let's see how this works. Here let's head over to the browser, and if you refresh this page, on every button clicked, you will notice that the useEffect gets triggered. If we leave this dependency array list empty, this effect gets called only once in the entire app lifetime. That too in mounting of this app component. But if you specify any state variable or the dependency list here, this useEffect will be called are executed anytime whenever this counter value changes. Since this is going to be an array, you can provide any number of dependency values. For now, I am using a single state variable and have mentioned the same in the dependency list. If you have multiple state variables and if you want to control this use effect based upon that, you can just mention the same state variables here, and whenever any of those state variable changes, this use effect gets called. And there is one more interesting scenario while mentioning the dependencies. Since I have mentioned earlier, second parameter for this use effect is going to be optional. You can either provide this value or completely ignore that parameter itself. Now by doing so, whenever any of the state variable changes, say for example we are going to have 5 to 10 different state variables, and any of those state variable changes, this use effect is going to get called. Instead of just explicitly mentioning those state variables, if you haven't provided any dependency list, then if any changes happen in this app component, this use effect gets triggered. And to be even more precise, let me get rid of the state variable itself. And I will also remove this button. And this time, I am just having a use effect with a callback function. I haven't provided the dependency array, neither I am using any state values or updating them. In this case, you will notice that if I refresh this browser, this use effect gets called. Don't worry about the use effect getting triggered 2 times. We will address that in the later part of this video. But all you need to observe is that this use effect gets called automatically no matter if there is a state updation or it is being explicitly called. With this, we can infer that this use effect gets triggered at least once whenever this component gets mounted. And this is yet one other thing which is more exciting while using use effect. Now consider we are going to have a single state variable where I will specify the initial state value as 0. Just like the previous case, let me create a button, and inside the on click, I am going to update the counter value, and here inside this use effect under the dependencies, I am going to provide a value counter. With the previous knowledge, you know that whenever the state value or the counter in this case is being updated, this console log statement should get executed. Initially it is set as 0, now I am setting it as 1. Therefore, this console log statement should get executed. If we head over to the browser and if I click this button, you will notice that initially it is being called 2 times, and whenever I click this console log statement gets executed. But if there is a scenario, say for example, instead of updating with a new value, what if I provide with a value which is same as the initial value? Here in this case, the initial value is set as 0, and inside the button click, I am trying to set the same value 0 to this counter. And this time, if I refresh this page, you will see that initially it is being called 2 times, and if I click this, it is not getting called the 3rd time. The reason is that in the previous video itself, we spoke about the process of bailout while using useState, which means that React will ignore if the updation value is similar to the previous value. Here the previous value is 0 and the updation value is going to be 0, where both are going to be same. So React will ignore the re-render, and that is the reason this use effect is not getting called when we are trying to update this counter with the same value. So this is one other thing which we need to keep in mind while working with use effects. And as you can see that every time when I refresh this browser, this console log statement gets executed 2 times. So whenever it comes to the development mode, this is going to be the React's default behavior. But this use effect should be called only once, right? Based upon this scenario, this use effect logically should occur only once. But in the console log, we see the use effect getting printed 2 times. This is one interesting scenario which we need to address when it comes to use effect. And to make it even more clear, let me try to explain it with the help of another example. And here before the use effect, let me create another method called handle increment. This is going to be an arrow function. And inside this function, all I will do is, I will try to increment the counter value. Inside this set method, I am going to pass in counter goes to counter plus 1. And if you have checked my previous video, you should be aware of what this actually is. This is going to be an updater function. which we already discussed in detail in my previous video of useState. So if you want to know more about that, you can check my previous video where we have explained in detail about how this updated function is going to work. Alright, so I'm not going to explain it all over again in this video. Keep it simple, like I'm going to increase the counter value by the factor of 1. Let me try to duplicate this 3 times. I will try to call this function inside this useEffect. And this should happen only once whenever this app component gets mounted. Let me get rid of this button. Instead, I will try to print the counter value in the UI. So what I am trying to do is, whenever this app component gets mounted, this handle increment function gets called. And inside this function, I am trying to increment the counter value by the factor of 1 for 3 times. So initially, the counter value is set as 0, and after executing this 3 times, the counter value should be 3. So whenever you try to print the same in the UI or the screen, we should get the counter value printed as 3. But let's see what happens. If I refresh this page, you will notice that instead of 3, we see the counter value as 6, which is actually the double of the original value. If I try to change it to 2, and if I refresh this page, we see the counter value as 8, but the expected result is 5. Since we are incrementing the counter value by the factor of 1 for 3 times, the final result should be 2 plus 3 is 5, but we are getting 8. So this clearly explains us that how React check if the function is pure or not to prevent any accidental impurities. And if you remember, whenever we try to console log anything inside this useEffect, we see them getting executed 2 times. The same happens here. So this handle increment function is getting called 2 times. If I try to console log something, you will notice that it is being executed 2 times. And that is the reason, instead of getting 5 in this case, this entire set get executed 2 times. Instead of getting the value as 5, we are getting it the double, which is 8. So this is not going to be an issue, however, in the development phase, unless the function is going to be a pure one. But for this scenario, to understand it, inside this main.txs file, if you get rid of the strict mode, to refresh this page, this time you will see the expected result, which is 5. So this clearly gives us an explanation how this React works with strict mode to prevent any accidental impurities. Now let's consider another scenario wherein whenever the component gets mounted, I need to print re-rendered in the console. So let me get rid of this state variable and also this function. Here they say this useEffect, I'm going to have a simple console log statement stating rendered. And whenever this app is going to get mounted, I need this console log to get executed. Therefore, if I refresh this page, as the app component gets mounted, I'm getting this console log being printed. And what if there is a scenario where we have 2 or more components, and whenever each of those components get mounted, I need this console log statement to get executed. And let me try to explain it even more simpler by creating another component. And inside this home component, if I want the console log like re-rendered to get triggered whenever this home component gets mounted, I need to create another useEffect. But if you notice that the logic inside this useEffect callback is going to be one and the same for both app component as well as this home component. In such cases, to prevent boilerplate or to prevent code duplication, all we need to do is we can just try to extract this useEffect as a custom hook. Let me copy this and create a separate file called useEffect. Wherein inside that I will try to paste this useEffect. So this useEffect hook is going to be a custom React hook which can be used by any component. So in this case, you can use that useEffect just by mentioning the function which is useEffect hook. And just call that function here and same inside the home component as well. And inside the app component, let's try to render the home component. And this time, if we head over to the browser and if you refresh this, you will see that you get this rendered being printed 2 times. The first one is for the app component when it gets mounted, and the second rendered is printed as a result of the home page which is being mounted inside the app component. So this is how you can create your own custom hook for useEffect if the callback function or the business logic inside your useEffect is going to be one and the same. Now we have almost addressed how to use useEffect in your React component. But there is yet one another scenario or feature which we have in useEffect. And that is nothing but the cleanup function. Consider we have a state variable counter and a useEffect. And inside this useEffect, just imagine like we are going to make an API call. Whenever this useEffect gets triggered, I am going to console log the statement which is API calling started. And since the API calling is going to be asynchronous function, I am not going to develop a real-time API call here. To keep it very simple and to mimic the same process, I am going to get the help of setTimeout method, which is going to create a delay of 5 seconds just to make it more realistic. So in this case, you can consider it like we are going to make an API call which is going to consume a delay of 5 seconds. And after a delay of 5 seconds, I am going to create another console log statement stating API call success. Whenever this useEffect is getting called, I am going to create a delay of 5 seconds, and after which I am going to print the console log statement. And the dependency for this useEffect is going to be the counter, because we are going to have a button which when click is going to trigger this useEffect. Let's create a simple button component. On the on-click event of this button, we will try to increment the counter value. Now, whenever this counter value gets incremented, this useEffect gets triggered. Considering this useEffect is going to call an API which consumes a delay of 5 seconds, and only after the delay of 5 seconds, this console log statement gets executed. So let's save this, and if I head over to the browser, and if I refresh this page, by default, the useEffect gets triggered automatically, which is the same scenario which we discussed at the very beginning. You don't need to trigger the useEffect the very first time. It gets called automatically. Following the first one, if I now click this increment button, you will see that after a delay of 5 seconds, we will get this API call success statement being printed. So this seems to be working perfectly fine unless there is a sync between the on-click and the return statement. But what if there is a scenario where we are developing a website for an e-commerce app? Or consider this increment button is going to trigger an API or make a complex business logic. And if there is a user who clicks this multiple times, what happens is this is going to make multiple requests to the API server. No matter whether the response is being returned or not, it is going to make multiple requests to our server, which is not something which we need to happen in a real case scenario, right? This will definitely make the server down. So what we need to do is, no matter how many times I click this increment button, I just want the server to respond only once. Or in our case, to make it even more simpler, no matter how many times I click this button, I just want this console log statement to get executed only once. So how to make this possible? And this is the place where the cleanup function comes in handy. All you need to do is, we need to return a function, technically a cleanup function, and inside which I am going to clear timeout. And this time, if I head over to the browser and if I refresh this page, useEffect gets called automatically for the very first time. And let's get rid of this console. If I click this button multiple times, no matter how many times I click, so this time I click this 19 times, but I am not going to get this API call success statement 19 times. Instead, I am going to get this printed only once. And that delay also is not going to be the aggregate of how many times I click this. It is going to be the same 5 seconds delay. So this is achieved only with the help of this cleanup function which we have in useEffect. So this cleanup function actually comes in handy whenever we try to make such kinds of business logic inside this useEffect. And to technically address this, what happens here is that whenever this useEffect is getting called the very first time, it triggers this effect, but it is not going to return this cleanup function. And only when this useEffect is getting called the second time, it first returns this cleanup function, and after which it executes this effect. And similarly, the third time it is going to return this cleanup function and then executes this effect. So only in the beginning, whenever this useEffect is being called, it executes this effect even before this cleanup function. But in the subsequent stages, it first returns this cleanup function and then executes this effect. And that is the reason in our case, for the very first time, it executes this set timeout function. And in the subsequent button presses, it returns this cleanup function where we have cleared this timeout. And that is the reason even if the timer has not completed, we are clearing it in the subsequent button presses. So we are not getting this console log statement being printed. So no matter how many times you click this button, it is going to clear this timeout and once again going to reset it as a brand new one. So that basically explains how this cleanup function works in useEffect. And this is basically all about the useEffect hook in React. Talking about the limitations of useEffect, there are majorly two limitations which comes while using useEffect. The first one is we can trigger this useEffect only when the value changes. We can have a conditional triggering here. It's like if the value is going to be 7 or 6, then execute this effect. So that is not actually possible while working with useEffect. It gets executed whenever this counter value changes. You can't specify conditional rendering here in say this useEffect. And secondly, if suppose there is a case we are having a complex task or a heavy business logic written down inside this useEffect, and whenever this counter value changes, this a function is being executed multiple times. So in such cases, useEffect may not recognize whether or not the complex task is worth rerunning again. In order to address that limitation is what comes the third React hook concept known as useMemo, which actually tries to solve that problem. And to get to know more about that third React hook concept, useMemo, you can subscribe my YouTube channel or watch my next video where we will explain how to use them in our React projects. Well, that's basically all about what we thought of explaining in useEffect. Hope you guys got a better understanding of using useEffect in your React component. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing and I will see you again in the next one.